Hello everyone. In this video presentation I want to talk about revision. Often people focus on the writing stage of writing and spend very little time on the revision part of it. And I want to show you what you can do in the revision stage. The revision stage is really where you begin to craft the paper. Up until this point you've been focusing on the message and making sure that you've got everything that you need to have in the draft. It's in the revision phase that you begin to shape the chapter or the paper so that it really appeals to your audience. So I'm going to take you through what I would suggest as a process for revising, and you'll see it's a little bit different from probably what you've heard before. Okay, so let's continue. So in the revision phase, I would suggest 4 rounds of revision. And the very first one is the big picture revision. And by this I mean you go back to the big picture issues. So your problem purpose statement. So you might at this point revise your problem purpose statements and then have a look at your draft to see whether or not that problem purpose statement appears in the draft and is aligned with everything else in the draft. Go back to the bare bones, the narrative, the argument, and the key message, and make sure that all of those are coming through in your paper or chapter in the way that you want them to. You might find that in the writing some things have shifted, so you need to adjust your argument perhaps, slightly change your questions maybe, your key message has become clearer. So in the big picture, what you're really looking at is the conceptualization again. So here you're focusing on the content and the message you want to convey. Have you got everything in terms of content, and have you got the message that you want to get across, coming across clearly? So revision 1 is the big picture. The second round of revision is to look at structure. So once you've got the what and the message in, now you want to look at whether or not you have it in the order that you want it to be in. So have a look. So in this round of revision, don't look at the language or the message. You're really looking at the structure of it. How am I telling the story? Decide how you want to tell the story and then shift, cut, and change passages as required. So you might be saying to yourself, do I want to begin with this paragraph? Or perhaps this would make a better paragraph at the end of this section. So you would look at the overall structure and then you would look at structures within sections. But in this round of revision, that's what you're focusing on. The next round of revision is the kind of crafting and coherence. And here what you're doing is you're going through each section and each paragraph and you're trying to make sure that they're all linked together. So here you're looking at the transitions between sections and the transitions between paragraphs. So you're looking at signposting, you're looking at linking paragraph to paragraph and linking section to section. You're trying to make sure that there's an overall coherence throughout the document. Okay, so yeah, let's move on to the next one. So the fourth round of revision is editing. And in here, this is where you begin to focus on the nitty-gritty. You're looking at sentences and words, and you're focusing on the details. But I just want to go back quickly and highlight the 4 rounds of revision. So revision 1 is the big picture, and that's where you're really looking at conceptualization and the content and the message. Revision 2 is the structure, and that's where you're looking at how you want to tell the story. Revision 3 is pulling it all together and making sure that there's a golden thread and that all the sections and paragraphs link together. And then the final stage of revision is editing, and this is where you get down to the language and to the sentences and words. And I would suggest 2 different kinds of editing. One is for clarity. And if you feel that you've got a problem with your English, this is the point that you would focus on: language clarity. Am I getting my message across clearly? And then the other phase of editing is revising for energy, and that's really looking at the pacing of your draft. So let's look at editing for clarity. So this is where you look at the language, you look at the words you're using, and you're trying to see whether or not you've got vague words. So just to give you an example, if you use a word like material or fabric, compared to using a word like silk, you can see that fabric or material encompasses a whole range of different kinds of fabrics or materials, whereas silk is much more precise, and it gives your reader an image, because silk immediately conjures up this image of being soft and, in my mind anyway, blowing in the wind. So that word silk is much more specific than fabric or material. So when you're looking at editing for clarity, you're looking to see whether you are using the most precise word that you can use, so that you're conveying a specific meaning, and you're not using words that are vague and ambiguous or too abstract that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So, there's simple things that you can do is have a look to see whether you've got too many this, there's, or it is, because there's an assumption that your reader will know what that's referring to. Often words that end in ly end up being fairly vague. Not in every case, but it's one way to actually have a look and see if your words are vague, is to look at the ly words. Look at abstraction. So any words that end in tions are often abstractions, and I'm going to post a link to Helen Sword's YouTube video on nominalizations, which is very useful, and she shows you how words become abstracted and then the meaning becomes abstracted as well. So look at the words you use, find clearer words, more accurate ones, more specific. The next very easy thing you can do is to have a look at your sentences and your paragraphs. So the first thing you can do is, if you've got sentences that are paragraphs long, you can make them shorter. Because if you try and read that sentence out loud, you will see that it'll be very difficult for you to do that, and definitely your reader will be asleep by the end of the paragraph. So shorten your sentences if you can. You don't want every sentence to be short, but you do want to have sentences that are at a reasonable length and not, half a page long. And then do the same thing with your paragraphs. Are your paragraphs too long? Shorten them. So one of the things you can focus on when you're doing this revision for clarity is to focus on the paragraph. So take it paragraph by paragraph and see whether or not your message is coming through clearly. So paragraph breaks occur when there's a break between one point and another, or in between one step and a sequence of steps, or if you want to give the reader a rest. So if you have 2 pages without a break, your reader's going to find that very hard going. So when you're revising for clarity, the first thing you can do is have a look at your paragraphs, break up long passages, try and focus on breaking up specific points so that your reader gets digestible chunks of text. So the basic structure for a paragraph is that you have some kind of issue or claim or point that you're trying to make. Now, often in books on writing, they'll say that you have to have this thesis statement and you need to say it right up front. But to me, it's not important where the thesis statement is or the issue is that you're claiming in this paragraph. It could be at the beginning, it actually could be at the end, it could be in the middle. But each paragraph should have a particular point that you're trying to make. And then there usually should be some kind of explanation, description, or elaboration. If you're making a claim, then you want to have some evidence or reason for that claim. And then you want a sentence somewhere in that paragraph which makes sense of it for the reader. So if you're saying, ice creams are great, then you want to say something like, well, they're great because if it's a hot day, they help to cool you down. And, the reason for this is that ice cream sales go up when the weather's warm. And then your implication is, something like, there are many reasons why ice creams are fun to have, but one of the key reasons is they keep you cool when it's hot. So the implication or the conclusion is making sense of that point. That's the basic structure for a paragraph. So one of the things you can do when you're going through this revision phase is to go through each paragraph and make sure that you're making a point in each paragraph. The second part of revision is revising for energy. And what I really mean here is having a look at your paper to see where the pace picks up and where it sort of slows down, and what you can do to make it much more active and detailed, so that your reader, instead of falling asleep, can picture what you're trying to say, and in the end really enjoys what you have to say, rather than the kind of academic writing that is typically so boring and deadly dull. So, academic writing doesn't have to be boring for it to be scholarly. And if you have a look at the really good academic writers, you'll find that they get you going with their writing. They make you enjoy what they're saying. They don't bore you to death. So, decide for yourself that this is something you want to do, that you don't want to bore your reader, and then look at how you can revise your writing for energy. Okay, so you want to focus on active writing. So instead of putting things in the passive, although there are times when you will want to use passive, but you don't want to have your entire thesis or paper in the passive. So instead of saying the supervisor caused the student to feel intimidated, which is very clumsy and we wouldn't really say that, to make it much more active, you would say the student felt intimidated by the supervisor. Rawlings argues that people are what make writing matter. So in the passive, people disappear. Nominalizations and in the passive, people disappear. So there are some times when you will need to use them, but if you can, put people in and let the writing become much more active. The other thing that makes writing very dull in academia is abstractions. So the more concrete your writing is, the more interesting it is. The more abstract it is, the more difficult it is to visualize or to see a picture in your mind as a reader. So use examples. Examples are a really great way to make your writing much more concrete and to pull the reader in. Use examples from the literature, use examples from your research, use examples when you're explaining things that are abstract, conceptually. The examples are really often the concrete bits that help your reader to see what you're trying to say. Use metaphors or analogies, although you have to think quite carefully about them because you don't want to give your reader a message that you haven't thought through. But metaphors and analogies also help things become much more concrete. Energetic writing pays attention to pacing. So short sentences speed up the pace. You don't want to have short sentences throughout the chapter because your reader will be huffing and puffing by the end. So you want a mix. So at the beginnings of, in introductions, you might want to have more short sentences. And then towards the middle, you can make the sentences longer. And then towards the end of that section, you can shorten the sentence again. So if you want to make a punchy statement and you really want to emphasize something, then a short sentence works really well for that. And also use different sentences to change the pace. So for example, dropping in a question will change the pace of that paragraph or that section. And as I said, shortening the sentence will do that too. So make introductions and conclusions very readable to balance the more dense and conceptual passages. Make the sentences where you're making sense of things much more readable. So you can have these dense conceptual passages, but there are lots of ways of making them more accessible. And having a sentence at the beginning and a sentence at the end that is accessible can help you do that. Another way of making dense passages readable is to include different voices. So, for example, if you have the voice of one authority, you can actually include them as a voice. So, As I said there, Rawlins argues, so you include their voice. You might want to include your participants' voices. So that's what I mean by different voices, to provide a change of pace. So the point I want to make here is that at the beginning, when you first write your draft, you don't want to be worrying about editing. And your writing will be full of all these things that I've been talking about: nominalizations, vague statements, unclear words, etc. In the early stages, you don't want to worry about them. But in the revision stage, that's when you want to focus on them. And one thing you can do is, as you're going through the different revision stages, is to print your chapter out in using different colored paper. And then you can actually see how you're progressing through this revision phase. But it's extremely satisfying as you can see this paper beginning to take shape. You can actually see how it becomes crafted. So the revision stage is where you craft the paper. And, I wouldn't skimp on this stage. I'd actually try and enjoy it. Think about the words you're using, think about the language, the paragraphs, and make it accessible. This is where you really begin to write beautifully. So make it accessible to your reader. Don't write something that will bore your reader to death. And best of luck with trying to write beautiful academic chapters.